Welcome to LBMC Cybersecurity's podcast, Cybersecurity Sense. I'm your host, Mark Burnett, and I am especially pleased to be joined today by a good friend, a coworker, and business partner of mine, Bill Dean, who leads LBMC's technical services practice. And, Bill, I want you to tell us a little bit about what technical services entails. But first, welcome to the podcast, Bill.
Thanks, Mark. I guess to kind of explain what technical services does, we do the coolest work of anyone in the firm. It's really hard to beat me in that argument. So we do web application pen testing, and we do system pen testing and wireless pen testing. And when the bad guys are successful in breaking into someone's network, we do incident response. We go in and we figure out how they did things. And we have a subset group that does a lot of forensic analysis for court cases. But overall, what we're trying to do is to help our clients to prepare for what the bad guys could actually do. We want to help them to get better by demonstrating the flaws that they have in their environment that we could take advantage of, meaning the bad guys could also do the same thing.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, as I talk to our clients, I typically say much better that we find it before the bad guys do. And they all nod in agreement and say, yes, thank goodness there are organizations like yours that have the skills that can do that. And, to the point you made as you were introducing yourself, I will admit, I often speak on behalf of the firm, and I'm happy to do that and help to share expertise. It almost always, when people ask me to speak, what they want to hear about is the hackers and what the hackers are doing and all the fun stories and things like that. So you're right. It is definitely one of the most interesting parts of working in a professional services firm. And I know that your team is fantastic at what they do. So to that end, Bill, I'm curious, maybe you could share with our listeners, since you've been doing this for a long time, you've got a very capable team. Matter of fact, a number of your team members have achieved international renown through their reputation and their achievements. I know you're proud of that. I certainly am. But what are some of the most common mistakes and issues that your team members see when you guys are doing this testing that's leaving companies vulnerable to compromise? What are the things that companies keep doing that leads to them getting hacked?
Yeah, and Mark, I've been in cybersecurity for almost 25 years now, and there's some things that's just, we'll use a sports analogy, just blocking and tackling. We still don't do very well. I mean, people say, cybersecurity is changing all of the time. It's getting very complicated. It is, but we're still not doing regular vulnerability scans. We're still not doing what we'll later talk about with the external attack surface management. If we don't know what's on our external perimeter, how in the world could we protect what that is? So with the shadow IT now being in cloud systems, meaning dev groups maybe spinning up assets in your Azure environment or AWS environment, if you don't know that it's there, how do you protect that? Something that is relatively new over the past 2 or 3 years when it comes to the cybersecurity basics is understanding the complexities of moving portions of your environment to the cloud environments, whether it's the systems or your authentication or the web applications. There's this fumble from time to time as the organization states, well, the cloud provider is taking care of my security. And the cloud provider says, well, the company that's responsible for these systems, they're taking care of their security. Well, no one ends up taking care of the security, and that's where problems happen.
Yeah, that's a good point. You're right. Something you said, Bill, vulnerability scanning, those of us that have been in security for a long time know that's been a basic kind of blocking and tackling, a no duh type thing for a long. Why are companies still struggling with vulnerability scanning? This is not something that is new to our profession. So what makes it so hard to accomplish?
I really don't know. I wish I had the answer to that question, but we do, Mark, as we do hundreds of pen tests every year, and we ask our clients, hey, do you have your vulnerability scanned? Because we don't want to rework that. We want to see what you found and kind of build on that to do the manual pen testing. And the overwhelming majority of the time, we just don't do those. And a lot of it comes down to resources. The licensing can somewhat be expensive, and they don't have the resources that want to do the scans. And web application scanning is a little bit different. So I get that. But I'm thinking, well, this is basic blocking and tackling. The issue is they want to move to something more sexy. They want to move to the high-end monitoring and, well, we have the EDR platforms and, we have all of these things that we feel would compensate for not doing the vulnerability scans. I beg to differ. The blocking and tackling is still really, really, really important. And just because you have the greatest EDR and you have the greatest companies that are monitoring your environment, that still doesn't identify your vulnerabilities. It just identifies when someone may be attacking those vulnerabilities.
Well, that's a good point, and, we've got some cybersecurity leaders from key organizations that hopefully will be joining us on this podcast in future, Bill. So maybe that'll be one of the questions I'll ask them is, do y'all do vulnerability scanning? Do you feel like you do it well? And, they may or may not be willing to share depending on their circumstances at their organization. But I do agree with you that, I'd like to think that companies are doing the scanning. Maybe what they're struggling with is the actual remediation. So the patching, they run the scans, and that maybe they know there are flaws, but just the through the course of the day and, the minimum amount of downtime that's allowed for the patching and the rebooting and things like that. And then of course the volume of work that's necessary may be part of the reason. And then you alluded to some of the shadow IT, and maybe some of it has to do with if they don't have it in their asset inventory, then their vulnerability scanner isn't scanning it, and those flaws are existing, and maybe those are the flaws that your team and the bad guys are finding when you're doing your testing work.
I can definitely say that. I mean, we do not get involved in remediation and patching the systems and those types of things. But you know me, Mark. I like to work with analogies. Just because you don't go to the doctor doesn't mean that you don't have some flaws that need to be looked at. So just avoiding the scans doesn't mean you don't have vulnerabilities. In fact, it makes it much worse. And so that's where combining that with, again, attack surface management, everything seems to come back to that from time to time. You need to at least know what your vulnerabilities are so you don't fall prey to someone attacking them. You need to know if you have any health issues so you avoid whatever causes the problems from that. So just avoiding it is not a good idea. I do realize that patching can be work and the downtime associated with that, but I'd rather know that I have the problem than not know that I have the problem.
Yeah, yeah. So, based on these observations that your team has had, Bill, I know you guys have tried to evolve the services that you provide to meet clients where they are. So, tell me a little bit about this LBMC Guard service that I know you've been recently telling me about and sharing with some of our clients. Tell me what led you to create this service, and what's a kind of the high level overview of what the heck it does.
I've been wanting this service for almost 11 years. June of 2014, there was an exploit that hit the market called Heartbleed. And for the listeners that have been in IT security for a long time, we'll never forget that day. What we found out was that there was an exploit and the internet was on fire with an open source piece of software that would allow you to read memory. That's a real geeky way of saying, again, the internet was on fire and bad things were happening. You could read credit card numbers, you could get passwords. I was with a different firm at the time, but I was still doing pen tests. My clients were calling, "Hey, are we vulnerable to this?" I'm like, "I don't know. This is June. I did your pen test like 10 months ago." So wanting to be a really good, client service consultant, we started pulling scans and we started looking and we're like, "Okay, yes, you are vulnerable to this because we see that you had OpenSSL during that time period." They patched it and we weren't being paid for this, Mark. I was just trying to do it because it was the right thing to do. And then I realized we got through that. And then 2 months later, something called Shell Shock came out. And then it's just been a litany of 3 or 4 times a year, something hits the market. And my clients want to know, am I vulnerable to this? Well, I haven't seen your scans. I don't know. So, how is it that we could stay in touch with their environment to realize if a new asset happens and if there's a new service or a new system, if it's going to be vulnerable to something? How could we just get an alert and I just tell them, you need to worry about this. You need to patch it because there's a new exploit out. You didn't realize someone installed this system. And it's that continuous, just kind of neighborhood watch. We use open source utilities to kind of look and see what's going on. Because even if I did a vulnerability scan on July 1st and I give you the results on July 9th, well, what if there's an exploit that comes out on July 12th? We wouldn't see that again until we do the scans again, probably in September. We're filling that gap with the external attack surface management, vulnerabilities, assets. If you look at the SANS top 20, one and two is inventory of software, inventory of hardware. If you can't do those things, the other 18 really don't matter.
Yeah. Okay. So are you monitoring the environments like what an MSP or an MDR would do?
We're not, and that's a clear distinction that I'd like to make. We're not ingesting logs. We're not interrogating the environment. We're not part of, um, you know, like a managed security provider or an endpoint detection response, we're using open source. Think of Shodan. So we're using Shodans. We're using different types of scanners. We're using DNS tools in which we will fingerprint your environment. Okay, you've got 7 hosts that are internet facing. We see 9 different services. Okay, that's 3 or 4 days. I'm gonna come back and look again. Do you have any more new hosts? Do you have any new services? And if you do, let me scan them for vulnerability. So it's kind of a neighborhood watch, but we are not ingesting logs. We're not a 24/7 SLA. We're going to notify you in 4 hours that you have this problem. It's about weekly. We're looking at the environment and we'll get an alert. What actually started a lot of this is we have our own pen testing environment up to anywhere between 55 and 70 servers. Don't tell anyone, Mark, but we're the shadow IT of LBMC. We've got a whole set of systems no one knows about, and no
I
one
think we
protects them,
just
but
sold the whole internet, by the way.
we have to maintain this. And so I stated to, our pen testing folks, this has to be the most secure environment ever. This is what we were using with a bunch of open source tools to monitor that environment because we're spinning up listeners and Cobalt Strike servers and phishing domains constantly. We have to keep that inventory to be sure that we're maintaining that. So through that, we've been doing that for a couple of years for our systems. Now we're doing it with other systems. But back to the original question, we're not ingesting logs. We're not interacting with the systems. We're just looking on the peripheral to see if there's new ports or services or vulnerabilities that the company needs to be aware of.
Okay, so you're doing this on a regular cadence. What happens then when that next big exploit comes out? The vulnerability is known, let's say, and so that the next Heartbleed or whatever it is, what are you doing then to proactively notify your clients, since you now, in theory, have some sort of an inventory of their systems that might have the vulnerability?
So when those happen, we have a cadence in which we schedule for the critical CVSS 10s, and we're notified of any of those vulnerabilities that are within the environments that we're watching, and we immediately notify our clients. We tell them what the problem is, where the problem is, which system, and how to fix it. When they feel that they fixed it, we will rescan it and we'll mark it remediated for them. So we will do the remediation testing for them. We won't do the remediation itself, but we will do the remediation testing.
Okay, great. And what about their stuff that's hosted in a cloud, not in their own environment?
It's a good question. There's a lot of confusion when it comes to just pen testing in general. And so our clients will often ask, well, we have a large AWS environment. Is that involved in our pen testing? And I give a legal answer. It depends. So if it's an external perimeter, if you have a CIDR range of a class C, a bunch of IP addresses, we don't know where that IP address is. If it's an AWS or Microsoft Azure, it's just part of our external pen test. We don't even know that it's there. On the internal testing, a lot of our clients will have internal subnets that route to AWS or Azure. That's part of our internal testing.
Okay.
There is a sweet spot there to where someone would like to have somewhat of a domain test to be sure that Azure or AWS, the controls are set up properly. That is a separate type of test, and that it's what we call a cloud controls test. Now, that's not covered with LBMC Guard, but your internal scans, vulnerability scans, your external vulnerability scans, if it's part of those environments, yeah, those will definitely be included. But the controls test is a little bit different.
Okay, great. Well, something you mentioned earlier, the external attack surface management. Tell me a little bit more about that. I understand the idea. If I don't know I have it, I can't protect it. But why is attack surface management so important?
Well, and I've provided bits and pieces as a teaser to get here, so I'm glad you kind of asked. I haven't brought it all together. As we were trying to design this for years, so what makes it very complicated is you have to have a complete inventory of your software versions to even understand if when a vulnerability becomes released, if you're vulnerable to it. So Heartbleed had the sexy name, it had the marketing logos and icons, but you had to be running a certain version of OpenSSL. So first you have to have an inventory and you have to know of all of your systems. So that's difficult in itself. Then what you have to realize is, okay, well, if someone installs a new system or opens a new port or a new service or there's a new web component, will my inventory automatically update? It's the automatic update of the inventory that's being monitored that's so difficult. And then once you have the up-to-date inventory of licenses and what versions, and then when you run the vulnerability scans, you determine what is and what's not vulnerable. That's a really good place to start, and that's how you do your vulnerability assessment. However, there's a time gap of 3 months if you're doing quarterly vulnerability scans. What's filling that gap? What's doing the network mapping, the inventory, the identification? What's this? What's filling that 3 month gap so you don't have to wait until your next cadence? The external attack surface management is kind of the spackle that keeps everything together throughout the year, in which, obviously you have us, or the client has LBMC at their disposal kind of as an extension of helping to work through those types of things, and just for, typical advice moving through that. But a pen test, someone sees it once a year. Quarterly vulnerability scans, you see it every quarter. External attack surface management, it's hourly, if not daily, if not weekly. So it's continuous.
Okay. Um, it seems to me what you're describing with LBMC Guard is a complement to a pen test, certainly not a replacement for a pen test. When I think about a penetration test, it's in essence you're kind of proving whether or not bad guys could find an exploit. But really, since the goal of a pen test is typically the trophy or the objective, once you get the objective, you're done. It doesn't necessarily give you a full picture of all of the vulnerabilities in the environment, which is why you often put together a bone scan with a pen test when you're wanting a holistic picture. But it seems to me that the LBMC Guard with the attack surface management, and then some of the strategic thinking about patching and things like that, makes for a more full circle picture of technical attack surface vulnerabilities.
Yeah, and you bring up a really good topic, Mark, when it comes to the confusion in our industry between vulnerability assessments and vulnerability management and what's a pen test. So I'll define it how we do it at LBMC, as you're well aware, because obviously, I came in after you had already established our practice. Vulnerability scans and management with LBMC Guard, that is automated. Those are tools. Those are pretty binary, yes or no. It does not have context. It assigns the default CVS suspect. Those are automated. Penetration tests are manual. Our ratio that I like to tell our clients is that our pen test is probably about 25 to 30% automated and 70% manual. That's what you're paying the premium for, is the extensive expertise of our group, not to run the vulnerability scans. Some companies will run the vulnerability scan and then call that a pen test. So we choose not to do that. And so you're right. The LBMC Guard does not replace the pen test. But Mark, what it really does is it helps us to be more efficient for our pen test. If we've done three cycles of the vulnerability scans and we're doing the external attack surface management, our pen test is not going to require as much of that to start with. And that's why I figure, well, if they're going to trust us, I'll give a 10% discount on the pen test itself, because there's a lot of time that's saved. It's going to be a different team. But all of that says it does not replace it. And there's a lot of talk about continuous penetration testing that I still can't get a clear definition of what that is. And Mark, I've been leading these teams for 16, 17 years.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if I don't understand what it is, I don't know if it is prime time yet. So I'm staying away from that terminology. We're doing the continuous vulnerability assessments, and we'll do the annual pen test. And pairing those together, I think, is a really good year-round solution for some.
And are you seeing, for the clients that are using LBMC Guard, when you're doing the pen testing, are you seeing that it is becoming more difficult for you guys, your team, to find a way in? Are you seeing, in other words, that it's having the desired effect for the client, which is reducing their vulnerable attack surface?
Yes, it becomes more difficult, but as you had described earlier, that also removes the more simple attacks. And as you know, most of our penetration tests, we're not like nation states. We do not have an infinite amount of time. We have a pretty defined amount of time to be successful. If the low hanging fruit is not possible, we spend more time on the much more complicated attacks that they're probably going to see from other skilled attackers. If we spend a week finding easy stuff and reporting that the vulnerability scans are finding, then you're not getting the best of our group. And so if we're doing the vulnerability scans throughout the year, I can't have, we have to have our top talent to be able to add value to that client from that pen test, because the easy stuff is no longer available. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So what about web applications? How do the web applications fit into the big picture? Are they included when you're looking at LMC Guard? Do you guys include an analysis of the web applications in your scanning and those types of things?
We're not directly, because there's some differences, and this will be probably for the more technical folks. So most of your vulnerability scanning is performed at what we call layer 3, the network layer. Web application is at a completely different level of the OSI. It's the application. So it's the HTTP and not the other types of address. So that's different tools. It's a different skill set. Our normal internal and external vulnerability scans, if we see a web application, there will be some basic scanning, but we have tools that are specific to the application layer that is different from our normal internal and external vulnerability scans. And our clients that have a somewhat of a compliance requirement. It could be SOC, it could be high trust because the apps within scope are part of the high trust or SOC. Those are where those applications are probably most valuable. And then PCI. PCI has the requirement to do specific web app testing because of the iframe
Yeah.
payment process.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it is a
Well,
bit different.
yes, good, good. Yes, thank you, Bill. There's one more thing that comes to mind when I think about the big picture of how to protect one's internet presence. Obviously, the kind of the gateway to the whole thing is the firewall, and I think people a lot of times take firewalls for granted because they're very sophisticated now, and more of the capabilities of detection, the protection are built into those firewalls. Um, but tell me a little bit about how you guys look at the firewall. What do you when you're thinking about it from an attack standpoint and from a protection standpoint, um, how does the firewall play into this whole the scheme?
Sure. So there's what I call the trusted firewall test and the untrusted, meaning the first firewall test we do as part of our penetration test is just what the attacker sees. What ports are open, what services are available, how is it at the layer 3 level is network traffic being passed. We also, for our LBMC guard clients, like to do something called a more formal firewall audit, meaning this is the trusted aspect of things, where the configuration of the firewall is downloaded into a text file, and we use tools and it is more of an automated because we don't have all the internal intelligence, but we use tools to determine firmware levels, what services, password storage levels, the inside of that firewall, how secure it's set up. And it will actually sometimes find overly permissive firewall rules. We don't have the business logic to know which networks should or shouldn't be talking to each other, but it will say, hey, do you realize this network has carte blanche access to this network? Is that what you really want? And sometimes the client will say, well, no, that's a card data environment. We should not have any traffic going there. So the two different types of tests are the pen tests, the port scans, the mapping, and then the internal. You give us your configuration. It's more of the authenticated type of test. And then we'll use some automated tools to look at that's specific to the configuration of your Palo Alto or your Fortinet or your Cisco firewalls to give you known vulnerabilities based on firmware levels, patch levels, what those may be.
Got it. Talking about firewalls, Bill, reminds me of a story. So a number of years ago, when I was a chief security officer, I would get together there were a couple other chief security officers in the same city as me, and we would get together, to commiserate and share ideas and try to make our organizations as secure as we could. And this was in the early days of chief security officers. And I remember one night over a steak, one of my colleagues at another organization says, hey, I'm really working hard to get my company to let me purchase a firewall. And the industry that they were in was one that wouldn't typically, it liked information sharing and wanted information to be free. So they discouraged that type of filtering. And so he had some trouble, but he said, I tell you what, he said, when I get a firewall installed, you ought to buy me a steak. And I said, you know what, that'll be a good challenge for you. You do that. And so good luck to you. And we got together 3 months later, and we were at dinner, and I said, so, how have you had any progress? He said, yep, Mark, absolutely. He said, I got it purchased. And he said, I got it and put in and turned on. And I'm like, man, way to go. Congratulations. That's a big deal. And so we go on and we have a lovely conversation through the rest of the evening. And I get the check and write the check. And as we're walking out the door, I said, hey, congratulations again on that firewall. And he said, thanks. Now I just got to get him to let me put some rules in place. So I think that's the challenge I think that we all face in cybersecurity is that organizations, they understand the need to be secure. They do want their data protected. They don't want the pain and the burden of a breach, but at the same time, I think a lot of times they see some of what we're doing as inhibiting or restricting access, restricting success. And so I think that just kind of that little story highlights some of the challenges we face in our profession.
Well, I also picked up on a little more information from that. You and I have known each other for 9, maybe 10 years. And even through this podcast, I've talked about how long I've been in cybersecurity and how long I've been leading teams. Your story about a colleague that was trying to get a firewall pretty much gives me some perspective as to how long you've been working in cybersecurity also. So I'll not ask the years. I don't think I need to.
Uh, well, listen, it's been a great profession for me. I know it is for you as well. And I certainly love interacting with our clients and our team members here at LBMC. We've got a great group of folks, and I wish there weren't a need for what we did, what we do, Bill. I say all the time, I wish that companies had all the resources that they needed to protect their data, and I wish that there weren't bad guys that were trying to steal data. But companies don't have all the resources that they need, and there are bad guys trying to access systems and steal data. And so that's where we come in. And so I look forward to moving to work with our clients and see if we can't help them stay ahead of the bad guys and protect themselves from attack. And I know LBMC Guard is another one of the arrows in the quiver that is available for that.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, Bill, man, listen, as you know, it's always good to chat with you, man. It's thanks a lot for spending some time with us today. And if any one of our listeners has any questions, please feel free to reach out to Bill Dean. You can reach him through lbmc.com. We'd love a chance to tell you more about LBMC Guard or any of the other technical services that we offer. Thanks, and stay secure.